Is the Bible really opposed to women? Does the New Testament really teach that wives must submit to their husbands? In the last video in this series, we saw that Christian wives were really no different to ancient wives. Life was a struggle for everybody, and Christians were no exception. But in other ways, the Christian family was quite different. But what did this mean for wives? Stay tuned to find out. In Ephesians 5:22, Paul says, "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord." Now, in the 21st century, this is a pretty problematic verse. But how would it have been heard in the first century? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. We saw in last week's video that the ancient family was more like a business. Everyone had a role to play. It was much more functional than it was maybe ideological. The goal of the family was survival. In a world where you live in a subsistence level poverty, everybody had a role to play, which was to contribute to the needs of the family. And so your priority is just staying alive, having enough food to feed the kids today. These are the basic things that every member of the family is working towards. And so for the Christian wives, this was their priority. This was their focus how they understood their role to be in this situation. And so within this setting, you've got the two primary roles. You've got the husband and the father. And so he, as the husband, was the CEO. He was the one who was taking care of the business. He was the public face of the company. And his primary role was to provide. He was the one going out to do the work and to provide the basic necessities for the family to survive. On the other hand, the wife was more like the chief operations officer. Her role was to look after the house. And bearing in mind that the ancient house was the office, it was the factory. That's where the work was done. The family business was run out of the household. And so somebody had to manage that. Somebody had to look after the children. Somebody had to look after the slaves if you had any. And so this was the role of the wife. She was the one who took care of the everyday operations of the business at home. And so for a woman, she was stuck in the house. That was just where she found herself. And the reason for that was somebody had to raise the kids. She was having children, as families do, and in having children, providing workers for the family business, but somebody had to raise them. She didn't have daycare as an option. She couldn't just send them down to daycare while she pursued her own business interests. That just wasn't an option for her. And in a world without contraception, she's always going to be pregnant. She's always going to be having more and more children. This is just her reality. And so for her, raising the children was her primary responsibility. But in amongst that, also looking after the everyday affairs of the household. And so these are just the default roles. This is just how everybody understands what their role in the world is. Everyone participates in that way. And so long as everybody's fulfilling their role, well, we survive. That's what our ultimate goal is in this time and place in which we find ourselves. And so how might she have heard this verse? Read it again. "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you would to the Lord." Now, for a woman in that time, a wife in that time, that was just status quo. Of course I'm going to submit to my husband. He's the head of the company, and it's my role to look after the house, to look after him and to make sure things are running. And he's out there doing the providing and looking after the family. This is the role. And so it wouldn't have come as any sort of a shock to her. What would have been more shocking is actually the verse that comes immediately before this. Paul says in Ephesians 5:21, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." Now, this is something we don't ever often pay attention to. We always focus on 5:22, the wives having to submit to their husbands. We never really pay attention to the 5:21, which actually says you all have to submit to one another. Wives, submit to your husbands, and husbands, submit to your wives. Everybody in the household needs to submit to each other. This is what is required of you in this new Christian household. And so this word submit that we're looking at is the Greek word hupotasso. It's a voluntary action. It's not you must obey. It's you get the choice in the matter. You voluntarily submit to this role that you have. But all of you have to submit to one another, husbands to the wives and wives to the husband. But what we also don't notice in 5:22 is that the word submit in our English Bibles actually isn't there in the Greek. The word's just simply not there. The Greek literally reads, "Wives, to your own husbands as you do to the Lord." Now, where's the word submit? Well, in the Greek, it's not necessary because it's provided in Ephesians 5:21. But for our English translations, we have to put it in there so that the sentence makes sense. And so we focus in on the wives submit, but it's not there in the original. The original says, everybody submits to one another, wives to your husbands. Well, that's what it means to submit to one another. Everybody has to submit in this particular context. And so then he finishes off the instructions in verse 23. He says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Saviour. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything." Well, again, that's just the status quo. Bearing in mind, too, that wives are usually much, much younger than the husbands. Women are typically married about the age of 13 to a man in his 20s, and so she's often at least 10 years younger than this man and is fully reliant on him because her role is to make children and his role is to help keep them alive. This is his job, and so for her to submit is just what is expected of a woman in this context. This is the only option that she really has. But another thing that we often don't pay attention to is what Paul then says to the husbands. Listen to what he says. He says, "Husbands," now I've put in brackets here, "submit to one another." Now, it's not there in your English Bibles, but it's there because of 5:21. Husbands, submit to your wives, which is a shocking command. This is just something that you would never tell a husband in the first century to do. That's not his role. She submits to him. He doesn't submit to her. Nevertheless, Paul says, submit to her and also love her with this agape love. Now, there are a couple of really fascinating things that are happening here. First of all, you might have noticed that he addresses the wives first. Did you see that? He says wives, then he addresses the husbands. Now, in any ancient context, you never address the wife before the husband, and yet Paul does here. He says, husbands, you are, in rhetorically at least, subservient to your wife. But then he goes on to say, I also want you to love her. Now, this is an unusual word, this agape love. It's just not something you really talked about in ancient Greek. They had different kinds of love, but agape wasn't really one that they focused on, particularly in marriage. The goal of a marriage was always concordia. It was always harmony. The idea being that in business, you are working together for a common good. And this, in this case, as we said, the common good being survival. So as long as everyone's playing their part, working together towards that common good, then the marriage is healthy, it's functioning, we've reached our goal for what we expect of a marriage. Paul says, no, I want you to go further on this. He says, husbands, I want you to love your wives in the same way that Christ loves the church. Now, how did he do that? Well, this is the crazy part. Christ gave himself up for her. Jesus died for his church, and he says to the husbands, I want you to do the same for her. Now, again, this is a world where as a husband, he can really do whatever he wants. There is no prerogative for him to even love his wife in any way. Yet Paul's saying, don't just love her, be willing to die for her. But then he keeps going on. He says to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with the water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In this way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. His priority now as a husband isn't just to keep his wife alive and to provide for her, but he needs to see her flourish. His priority now is her betterment, is her well-being. I mean, this is radical stuff. This is really, really radical stuff. Now, I think we miss it because we take for granted that that's how a marriage should work. But in a first century marriage, this is crazy. This is next level sort of thing. Really quite offensive from the part of the husbands. The wives are, hey, submit. Yeah, that's what we always are going to do. Tell us something new, Paul. But for the husbands, this stuff is really quite crazy. And so I began with a question. Do wives need to submit to their husbands? Well, yes. But in the same way, husbands also need to submit to their wives. It's mutual submission. This is the model that Paul wants his marriages to look like within the Christian church. But then in all of this, we need to be in submission to Christ. The goal of the marriage is now more than just survival. the goal of the marriage is to bring honor to the Christ who brings the marriage together. Well, I hope that's been helpful. Remember, if you want to go deeper on any of these topics, please be sure to check out the podcast. You'll find the links for that in the description below. But otherwise, thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.